How will we address the climate crisis? Climate One with Greg Dalton brings together advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to help you understand the most critical issue of our time. Because addressing the climate crisis begins by talking about it.
Each year, Climate One grants the Schneider Award for Outstanding Climate Science Communication to a natural or social scientist who's made extraordinary scientific contributions and communicated that knowledge to a broad public in a clear and compelling fashion. We're thrilled to talk today with the most recent Schneider Award winner, marine biologist, policy expert, and writer Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the co-founder of the Urban Ocean Lab and co-creator of the All We Can Save project. She exemplifies the rare combination of superb scientist and powerful communicator. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, welcome to Climate One.
It's so great to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. You wear so many hats, as I just described: marine biologist, policy expert, writer, communicator, advocate. How do you think about yourself these days and weave together all those climate identities?
That's a great question. It has become very hard to introduce myself. In fact, a lot of people refer to me as a professor because I once was an adjunct at NYU, and it's like the thing people can get their heads around as a real job. But right now, this may sound sort of weird or silly, but every morning I just wake up and try to think about how I can be most useful. And I think that's the easiest way to do my work. And it means that it changes a bit day to day. It doesn't mean I start from scratch every day, but it means that within the projects that I'm doing, within the collaborations that I have. In your introduction, it was very clear that I'm co-creator, co-founder, right? Co-editor. It's all about building teams and figuring out who you can team up with to get things done. So that's sort of a mushy answer, but that's where I'm at.
In 2019, you floated the idea of a Blue New Deal in an op-ed in Grist. The idea caught the attention of Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign, which then invited you to formalize it, became part of one of her famous plans. What prompted you to push for this idea of a Blue New Deal, and what would it do?
I'm so glad you asked about this because this is actually the piece of climate communication that I think I'm most proud of. It's the one I speak the least about now. And the idea came to be just over a lunch with Chad Nelson, who's the CEO of Surfrider. We were both talking about having read the Green New Deal resolution, and you get to page 10 or 11 out of 14. For those who haven't read it, it is short, it is double spaced and large font. It'll take you like 5 or 10 minutes. And I thought, wow, this is really ambitious and exciting, but they left out the ocean, and so it will not work because the ocean has absorbed 90+% of the heat we've trapped with greenhouse gases, right? It's absorbed over about a third of the carbon dioxide we've emitted. It is buffering us from the impacts. It is providing all these solutions in terms of protecting shorelines and renewable energy. And so if we leave out the ocean, then we're leaving out what a report that came out earlier this year calculated as about 20% of the climate solutions available to us. And so Chad Nelson and I thought, well, how can we help to make sure the ocean is included? And then we ended up connecting with Bren Smith, who is a regenerative ocean farmer who co-founded a nonprofit called Green Wave, who was also working on the same concept. And the three of us put our heads together for that op-ed in Grist called The Big Blue Gap in the Green New Deal. And that sort of became a policy memo with data for progress, and that caught the eye of the Warren campaign. And then with Maggie Thomas, who was her climate advisor, who is now chief of staff in the White House on climate, working with Gina McCarthy, she and I led the effort to craft that policy plan, which is something, that those ideas keep moving forward. And that's something that I'm working on now through Urban Ocean Lab, which, as you mentioned, is the policy think tank that I co-founded. So I think being able to interject the ocean into the climate narrative is something that I'm always trying to do. That is the core of my scientific training. So just consistently raising my hand and saying, hey, don't forget about the ocean. We're talking about climate solutions and climate policy.
Right, and I think without the oceans, there'd be some mind-blowing amount of surface temperature warming that I
Like
can
97 degrees hotter or
I,
something like
I,
that.
can't, I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
So, the Biden administration has proposed 30 by 30, conserving 30% of lands, 30% of oceans. But as you just said, oceans seem to often get left out. Tends to be
Yeah.
land centric. So how are they doing in terms of balancing the oceans and the lands, with the oceans often overlooked?
I think so. The United States actually has quite a large percentage of its exclusive economic zone, the waters that we have jurisdiction over, in protection. The exact percentage is slipping me, but it's actually, over 15, maybe 20%, something like this. But it's mostly very remote areas. So it's the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, right? It is these far away places where there aren't a lot of people, where there's not a lot of extraction happening. And so what I would like to see when we think about this goal of protecting 30% of nature by 2030 is that we're also protecting nature near where people live. We're not just going really far away where nothing was really happening anyway and saying, look, we protected this thing. It wasn't until the last few years that there was any sort of significant protection in the Northeast United States waters, right? Until we had the Northeast Seamounts and Canyons National Monument created. And so I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of making sure we have representative proportions of each ecosystem protected, not just far away places that people will never get a chance to visit and which are in many ways de facto protected. So that's kind of what I'm looking at and going to be advocating for when it comes to establishing more protected areas in the United States, not just 30% overall, but 30% of each ecosystem type as well.
The ones that are more at risk. More than 120 million people live in coastal counties in the United States. How will climate disruption impact the lives of those people? Is that mainly a story of risk, loss, and grief?
That's a very well put question. And I think the grief part, absolutely. I have a friend who reminds me that in part what we need to do to deal with the climate crisis is grieve, is mourn the things that are lost, that are being lost, so that we can really metabolize what's happening and then move on, because we don't really have the cultural norms or traditions for saying goodbye to things that are being lost because of climate change. And so we need to think about how do we, as a culture, create the new traditions that we need, the ceremonies in some sense that we need, because the place where you learned to swim, the place where you went fishing with your father, the place where you had your first kiss or learned to ride a bike might all be underwater, or those ecosystems might be unrecognizable from what they were a few decades ago, soon, if not already. So figuring out how to deal with that much change emotionally and culturally is something that I do not feel equipped to lead on, but I know a lot of people are helping us think through that. But your broader question, I think this term of coastal elite is a real pain in the butt, because as you described, about 40% of Americans live in coastal counties. About 30% live in coastal cities, which is why the work of Urban Ocean Lab is focused on how do we make policy change in coastal cities, because it's not an elite issue. It is 1 in 3 or 4 in 10 Americans, depending on how, sort of which geographic scope you're using to think about that. So figuring out what are the policy changes that we need to deal with the extreme weather events that we're already seeing and which will become more frequent is absolutely a critical need. And there's so much that we can do. I just want to be clear that I've been talking a lot about sort of how bad things are, and all of that is true. But what gets me out of bed in the morning, what makes this work of communicating about climate science and policy so important, is that we have such a huge spectrum of possible futures available to us. And those really depend, which one we get depends on what we do, right? We're not going to have a pristine planet with 8 billion people living on it and all of the changes that have already happened. But we could have like a really, really terrible future, or we could have like an actually pretty good and interesting one. And so I think I often get pegged as being an optimist or someone who's really hopeful. And those are titles that I actually don't relate to at all, because both of those words have in their definition that you expect a good outcome. I have no expectation or assumption that the outcome for humanity is necessarily going to be good. But I know that it could be much better than it would otherwise be if we sort of get our act together and move with immense speed and welcome as many people as possible into this work and show people that there really is a place for everyone in this transformation.
Marine
Yeah.
protected areas are sometimes pointed to as like when people get out of the way, nature comes back quickly. There, what's a positive story you can
Mm.
point to? Because it's one thing to say good things can happen in the future if we choose this path, but what good things have already happened that can be a little more specific? You can point to and say, this is possible. Let's do more of these.
So absolutely marine protected areas is one. And Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who is a previous winner of this award, probably can rattle off these facts more eloquently and robustly than I can at this point. It's been a while, but you have like several 100% increase in fish biomass, for example, within 5 or 10 years of establishing a marine protected area in some place. If we leave nature alone, if we give it a break, it can in fact replenish itself. If we just figure out how to back off a little bit. And so those kinds of things are very exciting to know about. I think just absolutely the resilience of nature is a major source of inspiration for me. And lately I've been reading this new book called Required Reading. And the subtitle is Climate Justice, Adaptation, and Investing in Indigenous Power. It's right here on my desk. And it's an anthology of essays by Indigenous leaders who are working on climate solutions, who are working on the cultural and policy and community level transformations that we need. And I keep using that word transformation because that's the only way I can think about the magnitude of change that's really needed. And I'm finding this book to be incredibly inspiring because so often we do our land acknowledgements, we talk about the value of Indigenous wisdom in addressing environmental issues, but it's something that I think not very many of us actually read about and study that wisdom in any detail. And so it's something that I have started to dedicate more of my time to. And overall, the answer to your question is, I don't know. And that's actually the next project that I'm working on. Is I'm writing a book with the tentative title of What If We Get It Right? Because I feel like it is so important for us to know what we are running towards, what all this work will get us. If we do charge ahead with the transformations around electricity and transportation and buildings and manufacturing and agriculture and land use, like what do we get? Show me that it's worth it. Show me that there's a place for me in this future. Show me that the work can be joyful and exciting along the way. And so that's what I am working to put together now.
You are the recipient of the Climate One Award in memory of Stephen Schneider, a pioneering climate scientist whose last book was Science as a Contact Sport. Did you know science was going to be a contact sport when you started to pursue a PhD in marine biology? Did you anticipate how rough it would be?
No, but I also did not anticipate in any sense the role that I would end up playing.
Mhm.
I never aspired to or expected to be any sort of public figure. I mean,
A
my
lot of
first job
scientists
out of
don't.
college.
That's not why people go into science, right? Yeah. You want
Exactly.
to be in your lab and do
But
your
I
work.
I also never thought I would be in the lab. So my first job out of college was working in the policy office at the Environmental Protection Agency in DC. Um, my major as an undergrad was environmental science and public policy. So I always wanted to work at this intersection of science and policy. And so for me, it was just a matter of how can I get this advanced degree in science in order to make sure that all the best science is used to inform policymaking. Even if I'm not the one doing that science, I will have the training to be able to interpret it, and convey the importance of it in the context of how we form policy. And so I guess the answer is no, but because I never thought of myself really as having a career as a research scientist, and I never thought of myself as having a, a public profile in any significant way. I thought I would just like be a policy wonk who had a bunch of science training that made me useful in a different way. Because some of the best advice I ever got was, Ayana, there are a lot of lawyers doing policy. There aren't as many scientists doing policy, so that I could help build the bridge from the other direction. So I kind of thought I would stay out of the fray.
How is that, sense of self changed recently? Because personally, I feel like the urgency with wildfires in the West, New York City, a subway flooding again,
Mhm.
it's more in our face these days. So how does that affect you and your
Yeah.
work?
You know, I feel very lucky that my brain chemistry doesn't tend towards anxiety and depression. That is just a luck of the draw of how I was constructed at birth. And I don't know, I know that it's much harder to do this work if you're more susceptible to those things. And so I'm really grateful that I have a mind that tends towards, okay, it's really bad. What are we going to do? Who's the team? What's the strategy? Let me make a checklist. Like, let me just chip away at this, is my immediate instinct when faced with even a problem of the magnitude of the climate crisis. But even I am stopped in my tracks by the horrors in the news, right? Because as you described, we're seeing the impacts of climate change all around us on a day-to-day basis now. We're seeing how people's lives and livelihoods and cultures and communities are at such extreme risk. And I'm not a robot, right? I feel those things, and I feel them in a way that I think is different from a lot of people. We hear so often that what we need in climate communication is more compelling storytelling, more
Mhm.
narratives about
Mhm.
people and how individuals are impacted, and dealing with this, and how individuals are working on solutions. But I think in part because of my training as a scientist, while I value that kind of journalism and communications work, the stuff that hits me the hardest is actually the graphs.
Hmm.
Like, I read the United Nations report on oceans and cryosphere, and I looked at the graphs of the scientific projections
Mm.
of sea level rise and ocean temperature and ecosystems and sea ice and all of these things. And I was on the New York City subway a few years ago, and that report came out, reading it. And I was crying in public because I knew what those numbers meant.
Mm.
And I had the same experience just a month ago, writing an essay on the ways in which the ocean has been impacted by climate change. Even though I've known for a long time about ocean acidification, about the risks to coastal ecosystems like coral reefs, which I studied for my PhD, about how coastal ecosystems are such an important buffer for the impacts of climate change for coastal communities, and how sea level rise is affecting people, and hurricanes and all this stuff is not new to me. But having to go back into the scientific literature, read the peer reviewed studies to make sure I was including the most up to date statistics, that barrage of scientific details about exactly how bad it is, what really just pummeled my spirit for a few weeks there.
Mm. Mm.
And so the thing for me is always thinking about, how do we sort of race through the bad stuff? I mean, acknowledge and absorb just how high the stakes are, so that we can know that we are grounded in that reality in order to move forward. I value that that all exists, but then I instantly want to switch from, okay, it's bad, it's worse than we can imagine, it's coming faster than we thought, but who does what, and how quickly can we make this transformation from a fossil fueled and extractive economy to a more regenerative one?
article you wrote in 2020 in the Washington Post, which was I first honestly remember hearing of you and reading about you. It was like, whoa, this I'm always on the lookout for rising stars and new voices and faces. And in these, you said, I'm a Black climate expert. Racism derails our efforts to save the planet. In it, you quote Toni Morrison saying, quote, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being, end quote. And I get that. And so part of me doesn't want to ask you about this, and yet I feel an obligation to do so. And as a white guy, with a show, could we spend a little bit of time talking about going that? And you talk in that piece about superficial tasks and the need to do deeper work.
The thing that I wish more people understood at this intersection of race and climate is that people of color already care and get it. In fact, are more concerned about climate than their white counterparts in the US. And for this, knowing we have to thank for this knowledge, the last year's recipients of this very award, Dr. Leiserowitz and Dr. Marabach, whose research, whose polling of Americans shows us that it's about 49% of white Americans who are concerned about climate change, 57% of Black Americans, and about 70% of Latinx Americans. So when we think about how are we going to address this crisis, it's how do we build the biggest, strongest team? And so how do we then welcome in the people who already get it, who already care, who are already disproportionately more likely to want to be a part of the solutions, to want their elected representatives to be more active on pushing forward climate legislation, who are more likely to volunteer, who are more likely to call their members of Congress. And to me, one of the most important findings of their research and polling is that it's not just because communities of color are more heavily impacted by climate change and extreme weather events that are fueled by climate change, right? That's what we think. We think, oh, it's because they're getting pummeled and they see it more viscerally that they are more concerned. Mm-hmm. And the answer is actually that, especially for Latinx communities in the US, it's because they have a more egalitarian worldview. Yeah. It's because they have this sense of needing to be a part of the solution, of this responsibility to your community, as opposed to a more individualistic worldview, which tends to be what more of the white people have in America in terms of this context around climate.
Interesting.
And so I think there's a really important lesson there, that it's not just about climate justice in terms of who is the most heavily impacted, which is where we normally focus our efforts on, the injustices associated with climate change. And it's absolutely critical to address those and make sure those do not become more extreme and in fact are reversed. But it's also really important to think about, who do we need at the table if we're going to work on solutions effectively? If we need these transformations in every community all over the world, who's going to be leading those transformations? I mean, it in every sector, in every town, in every part of our economy, in every corporation, at every level of government. And so we need leaders who can lead their communities. And that means we need a broad diversity of leaders. We need a lot of ideas at the table. And when I say diversity, I don't just mean racial diversity. I mean age diversity. I mean gender diversity. I mean geographic diversity, diversity in areas of expertise, diversity in ways that we think and approach problems. And so a lot of the work that I do in terms of climate communication really aims to say, like, you are welcome in this work. You are needed in this work. Let's think about where you will fit in. People who maybe didn't think there was a place for them before.
Yeah, welcoming rather than kind of guilt or other way coming into it. We have just one last question. I read in your Washington Post piece about your desire not to doom scroll on Twitter. I think that's something at risk for a lot of people. But in your Twitter feed, you support a campaign of calling out Edelman and other public relation firms that have helped fossil fuel companies sell lies to the American people for decades. And a lot of that story is known, Koch brothers, Exxon, et cetera, but a lot of that story is not as well known, and you're part of a group of people trying to lift it up. So what part of that climate denial story needs to be better known?
for me, sort of co-instigating and co-leading that campaign, which is, for those who want to look it up, it's hashtag Edelman Drop Exxon. Edelman is the largest PR company in the world, and they represent more fossil fuel clients than anyone else. So they have been doing this work of helping to greenwash, of suppressing our ability to get climate policy passed, of, just making it seem like it's our individual fault instead of the fault of fossil fuel companies, right? Sort of pretending that their tiny investments in renewable energy are actually something significant. And I think we can hopefully all agree at this point that we should stop advertising for fossil fuels, right? And so this was a chance to have people who work with Edelman, people who are seen as influencers, celebrities, people who just have a very large following on the internet, to get together and say, like, are you kidding me? We're still advertising this stuff. I mean, the people who signed on to that open letter, most of them are not climate activists, right? They are people who, like Alana Glazer, who's this incredible comedian, and Donald Glover, and like astrologers, right? These are like, and supermodels. These are people who are like, I have a platform, and this is not my issue, but even I know, like, come on, we've got to draw the line somewhere. And I think what the youth climate leadership is showing us also is this incredible moral clarity of, like, are you kidding me? Like, in 2021, we're still doing what? And I think the more we can kind of harness that energy in approaching this, like, come on, you guys, like, of course we should stop advertising for fossil fuels. Of course we should have climate policy in America that's actually going to help us meet and exceed the goals of the Paris Agreement. I think there's just a lot of energy and a lot of, like, of course we need to do this, that's happening now. And it's really exciting to think about how that might unfold and help us to reel all these climate solutions we have at our fingertips closer to being widespread reality.
Well, and thanks for your leadership and inspiration on that, and putting relationships at the center of it. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. Talking about climate can be hard and depressing. It also can be exciting and exhilarating, as you've seen here today. Please help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review, or even better yet, talking to a friend, sharing it with a friend. It really does help. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.